Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the Special Projects Editor at IDW and the architect of the Artist Edition program over there. It's Scott Dunbier. Thanks for coming on, Scott.
My pleasure, David.
So we are recording this on Friday, March 8th. I know it's been a busy day. How's the day been for you?
Pretty busy. I worked on the lineup for Paul Smith's Uncanny X-Men Artist Edition this morning, and I've already sent the scans for it to my designer, Siobhan Krzyzewski. And then I went over another Artist Edition. I marked it up for proofreading. My day's usually pretty busy.
I mean, at least this week you got a really big thing out the door because, at least from what I understand, the Artist Edition for David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One has left the building, right?
It has left the building.
Was it exciting to get that one out the door?
It was great. I mean, I worked with David more than 10 years ago to do the Daredevil Born Again Artist Edition. And this has been kind of a dream for me to do ever since then. And, finally got it to happen.
I did think that was interesting. I don't remember where I read that, but or maybe it was on Twitter. You said that was 10 years in the making, basically. What made this one such an anticipated one and one that kind of took that long to put together?
Well, it's a long story. Basically, first of all, the most popular Artist Edition in terms of sales that we ever had before we switched distribution to PRH, which is Penguin Random House, we used to go solely through Diamond. And David Mazzucchelli's Daredevil Born Again was the biggest seller we ever had, and it was received very well. I think it won an Eisner Award. And of course, I wanted to do Batman Year One. We had a relationship with DC. I used to actually work at DC. We had a relationship with them, and then things sort of changed. They decided for a while not to do Artist Editions. And then there was some talk about doing it with another company that was doing Artist Editions, but David really liked the way Daredevil Born Again came out, and he wanted to do it at IDW with me, which is very kind of him. And we finally after years got it going again at DC, and we worked out the paperwork, and it's the first new DC book that we are currently doing. We have a bunch of DC stuff that'll be coming out in the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah, I know you have was it the Jim Lee DC one and then the Neil Adams DC one that's coming out this year, and I think there was a listed DC War Stories as well.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the Jim Lee book is a new printing of a previously published Artist Edition. And so is the DC War book. Although the DC War book is slightly different, I added another Joe Kubert story from Joe's layouts. Sometimes you come across things and you just have to update the books. The Neil Adams book is completely new. It's going to be a mammoth book, more than 230 pages with 5 foldouts.
I know that Neil Adams is he's part of the story for Artist Editions come together, because the whole story started with you being part of an Amateur Press Association, an APA, where there was an original art edition that was coming out, and it was about Neil Adams, and you put together something that was kind of like the foundational element of it. So I imagine getting a deal together with DC where you could feature his DC work, which is a really huge part of his story. I imagine that's a big deal for you personally.
It definitely is. I mean, I was a DC kid growing up, and Neil Adams was one of my very first favorite artists. I loved his work on Deadman. I loved his work on Batman, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and the mystery stuff. So, yeah, working on this book is, it's really intimidating and gratifying. The APA that you mentioned, I had a bunch of Neil Adams art at the time, which was all sold to pay for this thing around me. And I did an interview with Neil for that APA. And it was a pretty long interview. I think it ran like 40 something pages, sort of career spanning thing. And I wanted to showcase some of the artwork I had, and some of the art was in pencil. And so when I tried to make photocopies of the pencil art, it just looked like crap. It's okay to make photocopies of black and white art. It's nice and crisp, but the pencils just looked horrible. So I went ahead and I made color photocopies where, in the mid 90s, they were a lot more expensive than they are now. And, but they look good. And that was sort of the first inspiration. That, and also I have to give a shout out to Chip Kidd. He did a book about collecting Batman that had a page in it from Batman 251, which is the Joker story, with Batman fighting a shark. And it was photographed, and you could see all of the blue pencil lines, all of the corrections, and it really looked beautiful. And so those were the first two inspirations for artist editions. And actually, as my son Sam would say, fun fact, that page that was in that book was a page I used to own many years ago.
I imagine, based on the fact that you used to be an original art dealer and the fact that you do all these artist editions, I imagine you've owned a lot of pages over your lifetime.
I have.
Is it true that you had a deal with Steve Dillon where you were going to buy every page from Preacher after the first issue? Like you had an agreement with him going into place? Because I read that and I was like, oh my God. First off, good call by you making that deal. But second off, who knew that it would become what it was? But is that something that you actually did?
Yes, it is. And what happened was when Preacher came out in, I don't know what year, 1993, 1994, I went to my local comic shop, Action Comics in New York City, and I picked up the first issue and I went home and I read it. And it was one of the funniest, best comics I've ever read in my life. So I called up Steve because, I didn't have email back then. And I called him up, and I'd known him for years. And I told him I wanted to buy every issue going forward. Although I did ask him one question. I asked if the pages were lettered, because I felt that selling them with the lettering on the boards would be very beneficial. And so he said yes. We worked out a price, and I got every issue.
So you were like the, I don't know, fifth reader of Preacher, basically. They would have, I'm sure Garth Ennis would look at it, Steve Dillon looked at it, DC editorial, and then you would get the pages and you could read it before it ever came out, probably.
Well, the I think the letter and the color is
Oh, yes, of course.
Also, they actually lost money on it at DC because I never bought another issue of Preacher. I just waited to read them from the original art.
That's amazing. Unbelievable. Well, I do want to go into some of your background because that connects with why you would have, Steve Dillon's phone number before we get into the artist editions. As far as I understand it, your career in comics started when you were an original art dealer back in the 1980s and 1990s. Were you representing artists, or were you more in kind of like the acquisition and sales side of original art? So you were kind of just dealing at shows and things like that?
Both. I would buy artwork outright for the most part, unless it was too expensive for me to pay the upfront cost for. Like when I started dealing with Brian Boland selling his Animal Man covers and then later his Wonder Woman covers, I would take a percentage and then send him a check. Simon Bisley, I actually think I bought all of Simon's art outright. But, I started out just buying comic art from collectors and from artists. And eventually, there were a number of artists that I dealt with on a regular basis. And then there were some, interesting projects that I bought. I made a deal to buy all the original art to Infinity Gauntlet. And I bought a good chunk of it, but my deal was with Perez and Rubenstein. And then when George didn't finish it, I think Ron Lim finished it. So I bought all the George Perez issues complete, and then I bought the Ron Lim ones from Joe. So I bought, 1/3 of each of those issues.
Oh my God. I apologize in advance. I'm going to be making like giant eyes over and over when you talk about this stuff, because when you say things like I was buying all of Infinity Gauntlet's original pages, you can't help but be a little shocked. But the thing that I think is interesting about that is I imagine that a lot of the relationships you formed and a lot of the things you learned during that time were really foundational for you. Like that was the period where you met Jim Lee, who eventually hired you at WildStorm, right?
Yeah, I met Jim in I think 1987 at WonderCon, I believe. And we've been friends ever since. We hit it off, and we eventually he asked me to come work for him at WildStorm, and I turned him down a few times because we didn't really have an idea of what I would do. So finally in 1994, he had an idea, and we talked about it, and I moved out in 1995, and I've been in California ever since.
That was La Jolla?
The office was in La Jolla, the La Jolla Bank Building at 888 Prospect. And I when I got there, my good friend John Nee, who was the president at the time, we didn't like each other very much at first, but he's my brother now. But he got mad because when Wills Portasio moved out of the studio, his office became vacant, and Jim gave me the office, which was the corner office that actually faced Prospect Street and the ocean. So it was a pretty nice office.
It was primo real estate, yeah. So you joined as the special projects editor in
No,
1995. No?
no, I joined as I don't even know if I had a title. It was just doing stuff that I do. So, I would sell some art, and I set up with that. And actually, my assistant was Linda Lee, Jim Lee's sister, who I love. And I did fine art prints. Back then, they were called Iris prints. Today they're called G Clays. Jim bought a G Clay printer, and then and I started. Oh, and I also arranged European tours. When we would go on these trips to various locations with artists and do signings. That was actually one of the most fun things that we did. And I also used to complain a lot about the books that we did because Jim would gravitate towards, when people would send in samples of their work, they would mainly be guys who drew like Jim. And so he used to sort of gravitate towards those guys and want to sort of mentor them and shape them. And I said, Jim, we've got one Jim Lee. Let's get other guys. And so I think I was a bit of a help in getting different kinds of artists in the door. Although I famously laughed at one of his artists that he said was great. He sent me faxes when I still lived in New York. And I said, Jim, I just don't know what you see in this guy. And that was J. Scott Campbell.
Oh boy.
But Jeff has also come around. His work, I think he is a stellar artist. But anyway.
I mean, that's the thing too, though, is it's one thing to see those pages then and then kind of see the evolution and see him on specific projects and stuff. It seemed like Jim kind of had seen something there, but it was funny. I was messaging with a retailer friend of mine earlier about the fact that you were coming on the podcast, and I was like, yeah, it's Scott Dunbier, the person who does the artist editions, and he was like, he's the person who did WildStorm, and then we just started talking about we were listing off all of the different people that we would like to see artist editions from that era while you were at WildStorm, because that's one of the things that I do think is really amazing is like, even if you ignore like the Jim Lee of it all, like you talk about like, we both listed Travis Charest on Wildcats as the very first pick, but then like, John Cassidy, Brian Hitch, Sean Phillips on multiple projects. My personal favorite, Sleeper, but you can't go wrong with his Wildcat stuff too. I mean, J. Scott Campbell, Humberto Ramos, et cetera, et cetera. I actually kind of feel like to some degree, that period that kind of kicked off around when you took over as editor-in-chief, or at least from what I understand, that was your title starting 1997. I think it's actually kind of underrated historically because there was just, I haven't even mentioned America's Best Comics, which has some of the best comics of the last 30 years, in my opinion. It was a really incredible time to be making comics there, it seems.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, looking back at it, it's sort of kind of crazy to think about all those books and all those artists. And also, to be fair, not all of them were people that I brought in. Actually, a lot of them probably were. But for instance, John Cassaday already had started at WildStorm on Desperado before I got there. Uh, and my friend, poor Jeff Marriott, was a little bit mad at me because at one point when I became editor in chief, I said, Jeff, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take this guy off of Desperados and put him on something else. He wasn't very happy with me for a week, but he understood. Yeah, I mean, it was a great time. I think in sort of romantic terms. So I would almost equate it, and people feel free to laugh at this, almost like Camelot, for one brief shining moment, because we had, a pretty interesting, good run. I mean, aside from the gentleman that you mentioned, we also had Sam Keith. And Sam did Four Women and Zero Girl. And there's so many more. I mean, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which by the way, I did not bring that in. That was Mike Heisler who brought that in.
Oh, okay.
But I was the editor on it. And here, fun fact, I'm not really sure, but I think I've actually edited more Alan Moore comics than Karen Berger.
Oh, wow.
But I'm not sure. Actually, want to hear a funny Sam Keith story since
Yeah.
you were asking about original art dealings? So I'll tell you something else that I had in my hands. I had all of the original art to Sandman #1. Sam mailed it to me. Sam is one of my closest friends. My son in the other room playing video games is named Sam after Sam. So I love him like a brother. But when that first issue, when I got those in that manila envelope with no packing, and I opened it up and I looked at it, I called up Sam and I said, Sam, I can't sell this shit. I'm gonna send it back to you.
Oh boy, life's great regrets.
No regret at all.
No, I know.
Yeah, I was an art dealer, and at that time it was not something that my customers were interested in, and that's okay.
I just had a couple of WildStorm questions. You were there from 1995 to 2008. It was quite the period. Were there any? I don't want to ask for a favorite. I feel like there's so many to choose from, but were there any projects you felt that like were particularly underrated or something that you always wanted to like see connect more than they necessarily did?
That's an interesting question. My mind was going to another place. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we had so many books that did so well. I don't know. I mean, I guess, I think a book like Four Women, I think was a very important story. And Sam did such a brilliant job on it, but nobody's ever read that book.
Right.
And so that would probably be the one that I would think would be fantastic for people to go back and read. Although I would say don't read the comics, read the trade paperback because Sam rewrote the ending. But that wasn't uncommon. Actually, there's a mini series that we did called Orbit. Maybe it's called Orbit. It was a Warren Ellis book drawn by Chris Sprouse. And the last issue of that book was expanded upon greatly in the trade paperback.
Oh, wow.
That's because I've always been very creator friendly, so I probably shouldn't let people rewrite or add stuff. But you know, I consider people like Warren Ellis. I mean, Warren Ellis is such a great talent. And I think, looking back at his work at WildStorm, and this isn't because I was the editor in chief or that I bought these books from Warren, but I think his WildStorm work is better than anything he did anywhere else. I mean, I love Transmet, like everybody, and other things, but to me, Planetary and the Authority were such great, perfect books for that era. And also, Planetary in particular has just a perfect ending. I mean, you look at the books that Warren has done, or any writer has done, and sometimes the ending is good, but Planetary, I think if you look at it, to me personally, it stands up really, really well.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Looking for the right place to read digital comics? You can find it at Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses, all day and date. It's just like a comic shop where you pay per book, but digital. Omnibus has even upped its game lately, as they've added a web reader in store on top of its iPad version, with iPhone and Android coming soon. Looking for an ideal digital comic store, but with an excellent shopping and reading experience? One that uses novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book? And one that features many of the best comics and publishers in comics today, including publishers like Image, Boom, Dark Horse, and more? You can find all that on Omnibus. Visit the web store or download the app today at omnibus.app. And now, back to the show. One other thing I want to ask about from your DC WildStorm time was you are actually notable in that you have created multiple very large format books over your time, not just the artist editions. You actually were the person behind the oversized hardcover absolute format, which started with The Authority. What made that make sense to you? Like, why was that something you thought that the kind of like the market and readers were missing?
One of the problems with Wildstorm, especially when we were bought by DC, is there was always an argument for some reason about paper quality. And if a book didn't sell enough copies, it was relegated to cheap paper, and it showed. And, we always pushed to get the best possible paper on our books, as IDW did when I started at IDW. But it was always an argument. And then one day we got these comp copies of a French edition of Wildcats X-Men. And it was oversized hardcover on beautiful paper. And, I looked at that and I remember John Layman and I were talking, going, holy shit, we got to do stuff like this.
Yeah.
That was, that's basically it. I mean, basically we stole the format from the French, but they've stolen enough stuff from us over the years, so it works out.
Those French editions, I was there in April, and ever since I've been obsessed because the way that they do a lot of their hardcovers is genuinely beautiful in terms of production, and sometimes the way that they display the art in a way that a lot of American comics aren't. And I could actually see a lot of that in the, like, not just the artist edition, but also the absolute ones. But I did want to ask, before we get into artist editions, you moved to IDW as its special projects editor in 2008, where you've done a variety of projects from artist editions we're here to talk about to also something we talked about before we started recording, some glorious complete collections of Berkeley Breathitt's Bloom County. What exactly is your purview, though? Are you able to basically choose your own adventure as the special projects editor?
Pretty much. I mean, it's a little bit different now than it used to be. I mean, it used to be I would go into Ted Adams' office, who used to be at WildStorm, and he invited me to IDW when I left WildStorm. And, I remember I gave him a list of things because we were talking and it was getting pretty serious about me coming over. And and I said to him, Ted, you need to know what you're getting into if you want to hire me. And so I gave him a list of like 20 things, some of which I offered to DC and WildStorm, and others I hadn't. And DC was not forthcoming in wanting to do a lot of the things I wanted to do. The Bloom County Library is one of those things, because obviously I saw the success of the Fantagraphics Peanuts books. And I thought Breathitt would be a great choice for that. And so I reached out to him. But yeah, I'm in a kind of unique position. I get to do, I mean, I get to do pretty much whatever I want, which, sounds kind of strange. But IDW has a great support team. There are a bunch of different people there who are very helpful in what I do, but I pretty much make the decisions on what to publish myself. And then, I have to get it approved, of course, but it's usually not too tough.
The artist editions were something you originally pitched at DC too, right? That was one of the things that you couldn't get going there.
No,
No?
that's something that I had thought about before, and I knew they would never do it.
Right.
And so when I came over to IDW, Ted Adams and I had an agreement that if there's ever something he does not want to publish, I could publish it on my own.
Hmm.
And I've never really had to do that. I mean, I guess I did because of two books. I did the John Paulione Artist Edition as a crowdfunding book.
The Winterman one?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And then I also did a book called Comics for Ukraine. And, I didn't want to do those at IDW. I mean, they were both charitable efforts, and it was important to get them to make as much money for, both causes, one being Ukrainian refugees and the other being John Paulione's daughter going to college. I talked to Ted and I told him about my idea to do artist editions, fully expecting him to say, "You're crazy, good luck." And Ted loved the idea, and we did it, and I've been doing artist editions ever since. The first one was in I don't know, 2010 maybe.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for listeners that don't know, I'll just walk through what they are. Artist edition books are something you've been doing since 2010, and they've won many awards over the 70 plus releases. I was actually having a really hard time counting them all because there's so many of them. But what those are, for those that don't know, is a series of massive books. Oh, we just got an Eisner Award out there. It's a series of massive books that collect complete issues of artist runs at the original size of the pages with full color scans that show all the details of the work you miss in the final product, like the blue lines and like varying notes and things like that, and zip-a-tone. It is without a doubt the coolest, largest way to see the art. I feel like a total fraud. Of the 70, I only have two. I'm gonna have three when the Mazzucchelli one comes out, or the year one comes out. But one thing I want to ask about is, so you pitched Ted Adams. We're gonna try it out. The first one was the Dave Stevens, The Rocketeer release. One thing I think is interesting is that hit in August of 2010. The next one, a Walt Simonson Thor one, arrived the following August, and that was the only one in 2011. And then there were 6 released in 2012. Were those first 2 years sort of like proof of concept years? Like you had to prove to Ted that people were going to go for these, massive and pretty expensive books before you could really start cooking with it?
No, Ted was always on board. Ted has always been a big supporter of mine and a good friend. He was always on board for doing these books, but we had to sell it to the other publishers, so it became a thing where I remember, we showed the Dave Stevens book to people at Comic-Con, and all of a sudden people wanted to do books like that with us. People were like, "Oh man, look at that." And I don't mean to be rude, but actually I've done 90 of these damn things.
90? What? Okay, first off, I'm bad at counting. Second off, that is an unbelievable amount.
It's
Okay.
all right. I am too. I didn't even know that. I asked, there's a website called aeindex.org that a
Okay.
guy runs, and it is a great, great site. If you're interested in artist editions, you should check it out. But when I have a question about artist editions, I email him.
You go to an outside source. That's amazing. One thing I'm curious about is, so you had this idea. It was kind of born from the genesis of that APA about Neil Adams and the Chip Kidd book that you talked about. Did what these eventually become match your initial vision, or did they evolve as you kind of developed the project and worked with like designers and things like that?
I try to make them better. I mean, each book is different, and there are things that happen that I'm very happy with. Other times, things I'm not so happy with. Like when a mistake gets through, I hate it. It's just the worst. But it's the same kind of book, and it's just trying to improve on that format. I think the Batman Year One, might be my favorite one so far. But ask me next year what my favorite one is. It'll probably be whatever book I'm working on then.
I'm sure you've seen it, but the year one release, I kind of feel like the collective comic artist community is preparing for that like it's a religious event. It's like I've seen people talking about it, and it is just everyone's like, I cannot wait for this. It's like Black Friday for comic art fans. They have to get their hands on it. I think it was like Mitch Gerrits who was like in particular like really really jazzed about it.
Can I share my screen with you?
Sure.
That is the cover of the book.
The cover is amazing.
Cover is pretty amazing. And Chip Kidd is such a good designer.
Yeah. Has Chip worked on other ones before?
No. And Chip actually asked me if he could do it, which was very, very nice.
Oh, wow.
So that is the first page.
See, this is the thing I think is really interesting about it is so when you were putting these together, you scan them in color, right? So you can have all the blue lines, but you can also have like the tape and things like that. And like one of the things I think is really interesting is seeing kind of on like the cover, it almost has I don't know what that is in the background, but it's like some I don't want to say a stain, but it looks stainish. And
It's stained.
it's stained. Yeah. I mean, but that's the thing that's really amazing is that when you scan them in color, you see everything, whether it's like something that was intentional or something that was unintentional. But one way or another, it's seeing the art in a way that you never could see it before, which is really incredible.
And it's funny because I only scanned 3 pages of this book.
Yeah, because he had all the pages himself, or he'd scanned them before.
He had all the pages and he scanned them himself. Yeah.
From what I understand, and this is either from you on Twitter or from something else, maybe this was for Born Again, but he didn't have all the pages, but some of them he already had high resolution scans himself or something.
When he sold anything from Batman Year One, which isn't a lot,
Right.
we had already done Born Again at that point, and so he had the foresight to scan it himself. A few things were not scanned, like the Who's Who piece of Commissioner Gordon, which will be in the book. Also, one of the covers that we used a portion of for the end papers, just the scan wasn't good enough. So a friend of mine owns that original cover. And so I went up to see him in Los Angeles and I scanned it, at 1200 DPI, which is big.
This would just make me wonder what Wednesday Comics would be like if you ended up doing that as like an artist edition, just because I did an interview with Mark Chiarello about that and a bunch of the people who worked on it. And I remember them all telling me that like some of the pages were done so big, like even bigger than the average bear. And I'm just trying to imagine the challenges that would present of trying to take those original pages and scan them to that degree. But that's one of the things I think is interesting is I imagine every one of these projects you take on, at least to some degree, introduces unique complications you maybe couldn't have expected or haven't experienced before when you're doing one of these.
Yeah, a good number can, yeah. And also, I just want to say that Wednesday Comics was just a brilliant idea and a beautiful, beautiful presentation.
It really was. It's one of my favorite projects ever, both in the collected format that is gigantic, but also in like the original newsprint stuff. But in terms of the process of how you kind of pick these books, like how do you decide what the right fits are? Are there any governing principles, or is it really just instinctual based off of what feels right to you?
Generally it's what I like. I mean, not every book has been something that resonated with me as it did with other people. Nothing against Ross Andrew. A lot of people consider him to be the definitive Spider-Man artist. And a lot of people love that book. It doesn't hit me the same way because, I'm a Steve Ditko guy.
Sure.
And, the same thing with Herb Trimpe, great artist, but not my particular stuff. My pal Chris Ryle is, out there listening to this and he's scowling, how can you say that? But sorry, Chris. It's basically, it's like people used to ask me, how do you price original art when I would have art? And I just would say, I make it up. I mean, there isn't well, not really a price guide for it. You have to just look at the page and make a judgment call. And that's the same thing, you pick. I mean, there are so many talented artists that I still want to work with, that I still want to do stuff with, and or do more of the work that I've done. Like, coming out in May is Chris Somney's Black Widow, and that guy is tremendous, and I love the Daredevil book that we did. And, I'd love to do more stuff with him. For me, he's a modern artist. People make fun of me, because most of the stuff I do tends to be a little bit older. My wife makes fun of me because I tell her I like modern music, like Pink and the Pretenders. But, but it just comes down to what I feel is both. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit pretentious here, but important, I mean, that's why, like, the EC stuff. I mean, there is not a better line ever in comics, as far as I'm concerned, than EC Comics, and I think I've done at least six, maybe seven artist editions. One, two, three, four. I think I've done seven artist editions so far. And I mean, you look at the work that Gaines was able to get going, I mean, fantastic stories, I've never seen it actually said, but I don't know. I mean, it seems like the Twilight Zone and Rod Serling must have been inspired by EC Comics in some way. But you look at stuff like that, Will Eisner's The Two Spirit books that I did, that stuff is so important to the history of comics, and to see it like that. One of the saddest things that I remember is when I worked at WildStorm, and DC had bought us, and there was a guy, an artist, actually a talented artist, who I think of him as a kid, but he's probably like, he must be in his like late 40s at least now, maybe 50s. Adam Archer. Do you know Adam?
Mm-mm.
Talented artist. He's married to Sandra Hope, who is just a phenomenally good inker. And she was at Wildstorm. She inked a lot of Umberto Ramos. But Adam, when he first started at Wildstorm, he was one of the receptionists that we had. And we used to talk about art, and I was always tell him how great Wally Wood was. And then one day he comes into my office, and he's holding the Thunder Agents collection that DC put out, and I hadn't seen it yet. And he said, "Why do you tell me this guy Wally Wood's so good? This looks terrible." And I looked at it, and it was terrible because it was just incredibly bad source material, And DC has done a lot of great books, but the Thunder Agents things, yeah, that wasn't one of their high points.
Not that it's the same thing as like J. Scott Campbell or something like that, but that's one of the things that's interesting is if you read like a recolored book or something like that, or you read like something that has the wrong scan or something like that, that can lead to a negative experience and make you think that maybe Wally Wood's not great or something like that, and it can color the entire experience. One thing that I did want to bring up is you brought up the modern thing, or the fact that there aren't as many kind of current artists. How do you feel that the shift towards digital art affects you? Because, if your entire program is based around putting up original pages, would you feature a book that was digitally produced
No, because it's really the same thing
as the book?
as the book. But let me just say something. I definitely, don't want to diss current artists, because there are so many great artists. I mean, there are artists that I've never heard of that are on Instagram that aren't in comics, that just do amazing, wonderful illustrations and stories. But it's not my particular stuff. But there's so much good stuff coming out. I mean, one person who, you know, is a fairly recent comic artist, if you think about it, but published her first graphic novel when she was in her 50s, is Emile Ferris.
Oh yeah.
I mean, everything she does, I gravitate towards because it's always great work. But there are a lot of artists that are new, that do great stuff, and but I got to go with my own passion to do this stuff. So the things that I am really into, like the stuff that I really would love to do that I've never had the opportunity to do, is Atomo or Hergé, or Liberatore. Liberatore I couldn't do because it would not be legal, probably. And I've reached out. Oh, and Mobius. Mobius is really, at the top also. But for whatever reason, those books haven't been able to happen. I've tried to reach out to all of them, and haven't really been successful with that.
Have you ever been to the Lake Como Comic Arts Festival?
I've actually been to Lake Como when I was 18, and I slept on somebody's lawn because I missed the last bus back to Milan to go to my youth hostel. But I have not been to the Lake Como Comic Arts Festival, which thankfully I'm going to rectify that by going in May with my wife.
Oh, Amazing.
And I am looking forward to that show so much. To me, that's the gold standard.
Hmm. In a weird way, this is a very incongruous comparison, but I'm gonna make it anyways. It's kind of like the comic convention version of your artist editions, in that you get a very unique experience you wouldn't get anywhere else. That you get, for yours is you get these big size pages that you wouldn't see anywhere else, where it's the actual size with all the detail. And with the Lake Como, I did a piece on it last year where I talked to a bunch of people who went, and then also the people who run it, and it's just interesting to hear about that experience, and where it's like one of their big things is they have a chair where you can sit in front of the artist and watch them
Yeah.
work. And like those details are like little things that are so art centric that most people wouldn't really think of. And it's just, I don't know. I would love to go. Also, I just want to go to Lake Como. TBD on whether or not I'd sleep on the lawn, but I probably would.
It's an incredibly beautiful place. My wife has never been to Italy, so she is really looking forward to that trip. I'm not sure how much time she's going to actually spend in the convention, but we'll have some nice dinners and do some sightseeing on off days.
Yeah, of course. I did have to ask, in the process of putting these together, do you have a lot of artists pitch you on considering them?
For artist editions or just in general?
Artist editions, yeah.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. There's so many artists I know who really, that would be kind of like a Mount Rushmore experience for them, where to like see their art in that sort of book. I don't know. I mean, it's tough. Like you're saying, it's like you've done 90 plus of them, but at the same time, you can't feature everything, and at the same time, you have to stay true to your vision. So,
I'll tell you one, sorry to interrupt, but I'll tell you one that's going to be coming out in the next couple of years that is a more modern artist, and somebody that sadly I was not really aware of until a couple of years ago. But my friend Felix Liu from Felix's
Felix
podcast.
Comic Art.
There you go, Felix Comic Art, who's a great guy and really one of the best art dealers out there. I mean, him and talking about the gold standard, him and Albert Moy to me are the ones who just stand out the most. Um, but with Felix, he introduced me to the work of Trad Moore,
Oh
and
yeah.
and so we're doing an artist edition of Trad Moore Silver Surfer.
Oh wow. The Silver Surfer Black Book.
Yeah,
That is going to be amazing. That's one of the things I think is interesting. I've talked to people where I'm sure you saw it. Like the Skybound is doing an what is it, a signature edition for Extremity of the Daniel Warren Johnson book right now, where it's basically an artist edition where it has like all 12 issues. But that's one of the things I think is interesting is I feel like to some degree there's like the artists who are the most popular in comics, but then there's the artists who are the most popular in original art, and like the ones who like really are doing like the crazy work. And Trad is one of those names, along with Daniel and like James Heron and things like that, who I'm pretty sure are all with Felix, that are like the ones where the original art community is kind of oriented around, and they're just like seeing their stuff original, like in like the original form, is just astonishing.
yeah, just so many wonderful, talented artists out there.
I did want to get into the process. What is the starting point when you're first putting one of these together? Is it just deciding which artist and project you're going to take on?
It's a process of deciding which artist I'd like to work with, and but also, almost as important, the material to do. So, first I start thinking about a project I want to do, and then I just sort of start it. Like here, I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of a fairly new project that is much, it came about much, much faster than most books usually do. Usually it's, a couple of years for each book. For the last 8, 9 years, I've been bugging Paul Smith about doing an artist edition. And he's, in theory, he likes them and he thinks they're cool, but he just didn't have any interest in doing them. He felt it would be just a little bit, maybe a bit pretentious, but also more work that he wanted to do. And he would always shoot me down. And then in July, every year I run this charity art auction at Baltimore Comic Con for Hero Initiative. And Paul has, very generously done a couple of pieces over the last couple of years for it. and he's going to do another one for it in September. But I called him up in July, and at the end of July after Comic-Con, we talked about the piece he was doing. He said he would get it done in time. And then I said, "Hey, while I have you on the phone, when are you going to do an artist edition with me?" And he just said, "Oh, God damn it. I told you, I don't want to do any signed editions. I don't want to write any damn introductions. And I say, "Well, Paul, you don't have to. You don't have to do that." And he goes, "I don't?" I said, "No. Well, I'll fly out to your house, I'll scan your art, and then we'll just do the book. I'll get somebody else to do signed editions, Chris Claremont. And I'll get somebody else to write an introduction, Louise Simonson." And he said, "Oh, okay." And then, he said, when do you want to come out?" And I'm thinking, okay, I don't want him to change his mind. So I say, "How about in 3 weeks?" And he goes, "Okay." And so I flew out there and I spent 3 days scanning. I'm not sure how many pages I scanned. It was 899 scans, but some of them were oversized and had to be scanned in two pieces. So, but it was probably came out to about 750 pages altogether. And then I reached out to my pal Sven Larson at Marvel, who's our contact at Marvel, and he loved it. And so, we put the Paul Smith, sort of moved it to the front of the line.
Yeah.
And so it's coming out in the fall. It's literally, with my designer right now. And then I also have enough art to do a second Paul Smith book of his Doctor Strange stuff. And it'll have other things too. Like he had the art for the very first comic story he ever did for Marvel Fanfare #1, a Daredevil story. And then after these two, I want to do Leave It to Chance. I scanned the first 4 issues, and I am going to be scanning issues 5 and 6 because they don't reside with Paul anymore, but I know who owns them.
Mm-hmm.
So the key is knowing who has the art, or if you don't know that, know someone who knows where it is.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Zoop is the new home for creator-owned crowdfunding. Visit zoop.gg to support campaigns by Harley Quinn's Chad Hardin, 2080's Jimmy Broxton, Comics Prodigy Near Levy, and The Phil's Chris Weston, amongst other live campaigns. There are more titles coming soon, so visit the site, sign up for alerts, and support these creators by putting out amazing books. To take part in all the fun, it takes less than 30 seconds to create an account. The e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. You can add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, every creator appreciates your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. That's the thing that always is kind of, from an outsider's perspective, the idea of trying to assemble all of these books is the thing that seems like it would be the biggest challenge. But at the same time, it's like, when you're talking about Chris Samnee keeps all of his pages. And David Mazzucchelli, it sounds like he keeps all of his pages, besides the ones he sells, but he scans them before he sends them out there.
Yeah.
And
Walter Simonson.
It sounds like Paul, and Walt Simonson, right. I imagine that part, the assembling, is a pretty variable experience where sometimes it's pretty easy and sometimes it requires a lot of, I don't want to say detective work, but not far from detective work.
It's not a bad description. I mean, it's, there is an element of Indiana Jones to it with not all the glamour. But, it's fun for me. I like the challenge. I like the experience of traveling and meeting people and seeing old friends. I mean, do you know who Mike Berkey is?
Mm-mm.
Okay, Mike Berkey is a comic art dealer. He's known as Ramita Man.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Now, I actually sold Mike Berkey his very first Spider-Man art back in the 80s, which is kind of funny. He talks about it on a podcast he did a while back. But Mike is a great help. Well, a lot of art dealers, a lot of people are so helpful in these books, but Mike has just a ton of Ramita Spider-Man art, including we just came out with a couple of months ago the John Romita newspaper strip artist edition, the Amazing Spider-Man newspaper strips. And Mike had all of those strips, or hundreds of them. I mean, and Mike lives like in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, and I really didn't want to fly to Ohio. And he was saying that he would, that if we fly him out to California, he'll come out and, he'll stay at my house and I'll scan all the art, and that was fine. But then he said, wait a minute, I'll be in Vegas betting on football in January last year. And why don't you come out to Vegas because you could drive there and I'll bring all the art. So the guy brought like 4 suitcases full of John Romita Spider-Man newspaper strips, and I spent days in that hotel room scanning it. My son Alex came along and he helped, but it was a great trip. I probably should have spent more time scanning because we had a couple of really good meals together, me and him and my son and his brothers. I have a very odd work experience.
You have a very interesting life. I mean, it seems like this project really kind of takes you to all kinds of places. Do you have like a mobile scanner unit that you've basically put together where it's like, I need this to do my job? You got it right next to you.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And you just pack that with you? It's like your suitcase to match with Ramita Man's suitcase, Mike Berkey's?
It's bigger than a suitcase. The scanner itself is, about this long and this wide and that high, but it gets put into a Pelican case and then it's shipped. And then like actually over here, I actually have a stack about that thick of art that I have to finish scanning on a project.
So when you take the pages into your own house, are these ones that are from people that are nearby that you can go and drive, or do people actually mail them to you?
The guy who brought me these pages flew from it was a 4-hour flight.
There is a very interesting heist movie you could make about your life in which you get heisted for like some crazy original art stuff. That's one of the things I think is really amazing is it's clear through your relationships throughout your years. And this goes back, I mean, this goes back to your original art days. This goes back to your WildStorm days. It seems like you would not have been able to make this project happen without that history because a lot of this is relationship management and making sure that these people who have these very desirable things trust you to take care of them.
That's pretty accurate. I occasionally will do scanning trips to meet a bunch of different people. So I was up in Los Angeles, which is just a drive for me. It's a 2-hour drive, 2.5-hour drive. And this one collector, I saw 5 or 6 different collectors. One of them brought, like 500 pieces of art for me and, by a bunch of different people, bunch of different artists. And, I've known the guy for close to 40 years and he just left them there with me because he knows me and he knows that it's important to me to take care of them. Another friend, this wonderful guy who lives in Hawaii, his name is Richard Martinez. He has such a great collection of Neil Adams art. It's not like, he doesn't have hundreds of pages of Neil's stuff, but he has hundreds of pages of a lot of different things, but he has, 20 or 30 just primo Neil Adams things. And this guy on his own dime flew to California. And actually, let me be fair. He's a former flight attendant, so he gets very cheap flights.
Sure, sure.
But he actually argued with me about when I said IDW would pay for his hotel. He said, no, no, no. And I said, Richard, come on. I mean, you're doing us a favor. But, the comic art community it really has a high percentage of just genuinely good and nice people.
Well, and it's also the thing for them too is like for a lot of them the reason why Richard like he has only the primo stuff and part of the reason that's probably true is because it means a lot to him.
Oh yeah.
And he probably wants this thing to be made and so he'll bring it so he can make sure that something amazing can happen that you can put together from his scan or your scans.
Here, hang on a second. I'll show you a few examples of Richard's. I'm only going to show Richard's stuff. I'm not going to show anything else, but
Oh my God. So this is Batman 244. It's the Ra's al Ghul and Batman. Chest hair is out of this world on Batman on this page.
And the next page.
The Talia. Yeah. Oh my God. That is the definition of primo right there.
You can't really get any better Neil Adams Batman sequential pages.
No.
And
Oh
just
wow.
one of the best Dead Man covers.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'll just show you one more page. I'll skip the rest just because there's, too much.
Oh wow.
This is page 12 from a story called What Can One Man Do, which was the first story that Elliot S. Maggin ever wrote for comics. And it was a crazy story about this story. Neil lost the art for it on a subway, half of the art. He'd already turned in the first half. And so he had to redraw basically half the pages. And because of the time deadline, if you look at this page, it's in pencil.
Mm-hmm.
It was printed in pencil. And it's truly one of the best jobs Neil ever did. It printed on newsprint. It looked terrible, but hopefully it'll look pretty good when it's printed in the artist edition. And I'm very happy with this book. I'm very happy. This is sort of a benchmark year for artist editions. I mean, there will be, I guess, like maybe of new ones, maybe six. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A couple of reprints. I once did 13 in one year, and that nearly killed me.
Yeah. How long does the process take typically? I mean, I'm sure there's a broad range of experiences.
It depends on a lot of things, there's actually a lot of work going to sort of finessing the pages a bit. It goes from very simple stuff like straightening the art, because you don't want to have pages crooked on the page. So I go through and I straighten them out. And then I do minor color corrections, sometimes a little bit more than others. But I a lot of times I just sort of have to eyeball it and guess, but I try to make it look as good as it can. The process of doing one book, once I have all the art, is probably a month and a half.
Sure. Well, 13. 13 is, the math is not your friend on that one, but at the same time, I'm sure you had a lot of lead time to some degree. So I have the Jim Lee X-Men one. And the Jim Lee X-Men one is interesting because it has these like fold-outs where it's got like the X-Men #1 cover and it's got some other pieces on there. How much of the process for you for putting these books together, like you were talking about the color corrections and things like that, is problem solving things like that and trying to find the right way to like display this stuff, because there are certain ways you could do this, but the best way to do this, the way to show it the best as you possibly can, is to do things like this. So is a lot of it kind of just conceptualizing how you could possibly approach and find solutions for these sorts of things?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've had arguments with a lot of different rabid collectors about, how far to go and to go further. Some people like pages to be stark white. Others like to see more of the blemishes. It's, I try to go for the best middle ground for it, doing it so I feel it's aesthetically pleasing, because at the end of the day, that's the only tentpole I have, my own judgment.
I mean, for me personally, and not to say that other people's opinions aren't valid, but the thing about the artist editions to me that's special is that like you look through this and you can see all the notes. Like one of my favorite sections, I was obsessed with the X-Men trading cards when I was a kid, the Jim Lee ones, and you including or these being included in there and seeing all the blue lines and seeing all the like the notes on there. That stuff is so cool to me. And it's like if I wanted a black and white edition, it's like my friend Sean Kirkham. I don't know if you know Sean Kirkham, but Sean, he sent me, I think it was either a French or a Spanish edition of the first volume of Jim Lee's X-Men, like the adjectiveless volume, and it's all black and white. And so you can see it black and white. And that's cool, but it's not this. It's slightly different. And that's the thing that I feel, at least to me, makes an artist edition, because it shows you things you wouldn't see otherwise.
That's generally how I feel about it.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir with that one, but just a few more questions. Obviously, there's been a lot of tricky projects, but do you feel like, I don't know, has there been anything that was particularly complicated in the process of putting it together? Like something you found to be a unique one in that way?
There have been some challenging books. The Steranko book was a bit of a challenge, but, I can't argue with the results. It turned out great. Jim is a character. I'm still hoping to do a follow-up to that book, the second Steranko artist edition. No, I mean, not it's hard to describe. I mean, some books I've really had to do a lot of work on, like the Todd McFarlane book. I flew in 2001 from San Diego with my son Alex, who was there to help me. We flew from San Diego to Washington, D.C. And then we arrived maybe at 5 o'clock at night, and we got into the rental car and drove to South Carolina. And at the hotel, my scanner was waiting for me because I had it shipped to the hotel. And I scanned, like 70 Todd McFarlane Spider-Man pages that were in a collection. 2 days later, we drove up to Washington, D.C. again. And this time we spent the night there, and I scanned art from a collector who lived in Washington, D.C. And then the next day, we drove up to New Jersey, and my son is under 25, so he couldn't drive the rental car. We drove up to New Jersey, and I went to a comic art show there, and I scanned, hundreds of pages that just were there at the comic art show. And then that night after the show, or maybe it was the night before, a friend of mine who happened to live near the comic art show but didn't want to go to the show because he didn't want to talk to people, brought some art to my hotel room, and I scanned it in my hotel room. And then the next day, Alex and I drove to New York because by some weird coincidence, it was 9/11. It was the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And so we went down to Ground Zero, which, as a New Yorker, I've never until then been able emotionally to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And but we went, and it was the 20th anniversary, so I figured, if you're gonna go. And so we went to it, and it was very emotional. And then we drove back to New Jersey, and then the next morning we drove back to Washington, D.C., and then flew home. I was there for 4 days and drove 1,900 miles. I'm too old for this shit.
I do think that brings up something that I think is really a fun consistency in your stories. It seems like something you've been able to share with your kids in a really fun way, like some really unique experiences.
Yeah. I try to do that. I haven't always been the best father. My idea of a vacation used to be to go to Comic-Con with my kids. But, over the last 10 years, I've been making a real effort to do different things.
Yeah. I mean, those are some really interesting experiences. Just a couple more questions. Do you ever scan without knowing that you have a project for it? Like, I know you have the artifact editions where it's like,
of course.
Oh, you do? Okay, so you're just kind of
Sure.
always scanning.
If I'm somewhere and somebody has some amazing art, why not scan it?
That's true. You might never come across it again.
You never know. Like, for instance, I have some scans of short stories that don't really have any place to go, but I'm gonna do a Marvel Bronze Age book of stories and issues, and some of those are going to wind up in there. And that's down the line. And I got to come up with a good title for it because Bronze Age doesn't really resonate.
How many hard drives do you have of art?
Uh,
Enough you have to look around your office to try to find them all.
my main one is 8 terabytes, and it's right next to my computer. And then I have a bunch of portable ones, and then I have a couple of backup ones also.
Yeah, that's the thing that I think is interesting is I never really, I kind of, when I originally thought about this, I thought about you having a specific project and then going full Indiana Jones detective mode where you're trying to find the specific pages. And I'm sure that that's part of it. But it does seem like, especially with the artifact editions, where like the other variant, the other species, where it's not complete stories, it's just like highlights of a bunch of different books. It seems like sometimes you could almost, I don't want to say unintentionally, but kind of fall into a Bronze Age book where the opportunity presents itself, and next thing you know, you've built something interesting that isn't an artist edition, but maybe it's a artifact edition or something like that.
Like I'll tell you, we don't have any agreement with DC on it yet, but I sort of have enough material to do a Jim Aparo book, a Jim Aparo Batman book. And I know where there are a bunch of other things by Aparo. So if we ever decide to do, and that's my intention, I can keep on getting scans. And, one thing I like to do, I like to upgrade my scans. So, for instance, on the Neil Adams book, I need to get the lineup to my designer. I promised it to him by Monday. I need to cull that book down by about 100 pages because, the book's going to be 232 pages plus 5 foldouts, and I probably have about 350 scans.
Wow. Yeah.
But, to me, it's sort of the question of, do you like the White Album? Could the White Album have been like just the greatest Beatles album ever if it was one album? Or should it have been two? And, I kind of go for the one. As much as I love the White Album, I don't have the option of doing 2 books. And I don't even have the option of doing a second book later because that would sort of mean I would have to pull back great stuff for it. I mean, this Neil Adams book is going to be ridiculous. I mean, I think I have like 7 complete stories, like I have a Batman story, I have a Green Lantern story, a Dead Man story, 2 just ridiculously great mystery stories. I have a short story that's El Diablo, inked by Bernie Wrightson, and I have this little gem that nobody even knows what it is, and it's a private life of Clark Kent story about Clark Kent babysitting, and he doesn't want to use his superpowers to find the baby when the baby disappears. So the lesson there is, don't get Clark Kent to be a babysitter. But Neil penciled and inked that story, and it's just a gorgeous little job. And then, the covers I have are, just about every great cover that Neil did that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Joker 5-way revenge cover, Green Lantern 86 or 76 rather, where Green Lantern and Green Arrow are on the cover and Green Arrow is destroying the power battery. I have the My Ward is a Junkie cover, which I used to own. And
oh my God.
I know for sure what's going to be in, and then I have to just sort of pare it down.
Yeah.
And that can be tough.
That is tough, but it seems like you're the right man for the job. But Scott, I could keep talking about this stuff with you forever, but that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about the artist editions, original art, your love of all this stuff and everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me anytime you want.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with IDW Special Projects Editor Scott Dunbier. You can find him on Twitter and his work in IDW's Artist Edition program. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story Webcomic, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Kenny Myers, JKJ Art, Faith Aaron Hicks, Yeah Comics, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Danny Ollie, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Alan Ellsworth, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hull, Chris Dorey, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Orens, Capes and Tights Podcast, Claus Van Devent, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Power, Declan Shalvey, Dan Gurino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stephen Hall, Philip Myra, Chris Bachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Walt's Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gibb, Sean Kirkham, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwand, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Assey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abbott, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote performed Off-Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.